Hey, this week's video is a little bit different. It shows how I reclaim and recycle the clay in my studio. This is an ever ongoing process, and the techniques I'll show in this video are already widely practiced and well known. There's nothing new here, but I thought I'd share the process with you anyway, as a number of you have been asking about how I do this. Reclaim is the term used by us potters to refer to any clay that's recycled. It's the slops and slip that gathers in your wheel tray, and it's the turnings that come off the bowl when you trim them. The wheel I use has a little hose that leads from the wheel tray into a bucket next to me. It slowly accumulates slop over a couple of weeks, and I even push down the worst of it just to clear my wheel tray if I need to. This bucket, once filled with water and slop, is then filled up further with all the trimmings from my bowls and all my other pots too. These thin trimmings dissolve very quickly and slake down in the water, but I never put anything into the bucket that's a big lump of leather hard clay, as it's very difficult to slake down. So with any larger lump of clay that I want to recycle, I make sure that I dry it out fully to bone dry before I put it into the bucket, whereas most of the thinner trimmings like this can simply go straight in, and I really do accumulate a lot of these. I trim away about half the thrown weight of these bowls, and after a long day spent trimming dozens and dozens of bowls, I can quite easily fill up one of these buckets in a single day, so keeping on top of it all and making sure it doesn't build up too much is a pretty good idea, otherwise it can quickly get out of hand. So really I just let this bucket slowly accumulate, filling it with as much waste clay as possible. Not just stuff from the wheel tray. I'll put the slip from my throwing water in there, and even the water that I pull handles with. Eventually I'll let that settle, I'll pour off the water, and then I'll pour the slip into this bucket too. I even have a specific bowl of water kept aside just for cleaning my tools, and at the end of the week I'll pour off the water, and then dump all the settled clay into this bucket. So all in all, there's actually very little waste, and I pour barely any clay down the sink itself. Once the bucket is totally full, I'll cover all the clay with water and then I'll leave it for a day or two, just to let it all properly slake down. And then I give the slops a real good mix, just to make sure there are no firmer bits hidden in there, or any bits of clay that still need to dissolve. I found that keeping my reclaim actually quite dry helps a lot with its drying process and speeds things up no end. By that I mean, I don't really cover it in too much water, or let it get to a really fine slip consistency, as very wet reclaim can totally saturate your plaster bats, and it will also take much longer to dry out, and the plaster bats are where this is headed next, and conveniently, they aren't very far away at all, just so I'm not lugging around reclaim across the entire studio. I simply ladle it out bit by bit, until I cover the bat evenly in a nice thick layer of clay. And not that you can see it here very well, but I've actually raised up my bats about 6 inches off the ground, just so there's airflow that can get underneath them, which helps to dry out the bats when they're not in use. I also don't like putting my plaster bats on any wooden surfaces or supports, as these will start to get mouldy quite quickly, as they're in constant contact with the wet bats. These particular bats were made from a recipe of 8,320 grams potter's plaster, mixed with 2,080 grams of Herculite plaster. I'll make sure to put those quantities and the recipe I use in the description of this post below. Plaster bats are one of those things that you'll find endless recipes for online, and they'll all more or less do pretty much the same thing. Personally, I like to include Herculite as it makes the bats quite strong and resistant to being knocked, as inevitably that's how they end up getting damaged and chipped. And I much prefer thick bats as opposed to thin bats, as I feel like they draw out the moisture a lot quicker, and they tend not to get saturated with water quite so easily. As for layering the clay out onto the bats, again you'll find lots of different methods. Some people poke holes so that air can get in them and dry it out faster, and others choose to leave it very textured and rough on top, just so there are lots of peaks that can dry out quickly. But I've always just preferred to smooth them out nice and evenly. That way it dries out at an even rate, and I don't end up with any parts of the clay that are harder than the others that might become troublesome to mix in later on. Usually a day or so later, I flip over the slabs of clay so that the other side can begin to dry out. It's also worth noting that this entire process changes depending on what the weather's like. In the hotter summer months I can sometimes even flip the clay the same day, and in the winter it can take the better half of a week before I can do the same thing. So by no means is what I say here a guide, as it'll change depending on what your studio is like and the country you live in. In this instance, I'm using clay that's slightly softer, as I'll later be mixing it with clay from the bag that's much firmer. This is clay that was at the bottom of the pile that I never got around to using. So now, as it's too firm to use by itself, I have to mix it down using some of this softer reclaim. So in some ways it can be quite useful to have some reclaim that's kept aside that's too soft, just in case you need to soften down some already very firm clay. But fundamentally this whole process depends on what your practice is like, and you need to alter it depending on what suits you. When I'm mixing two firmnesses of clay together, I like to make them into the same shape block first. This is so when it comes to layering them, it's an easier process and the block ends up being neater too. This plastic wrapped clay is the stuff I removed from the plaster batt. The plastic simply keeps it from drying out too much, and I've bought a big roll of dry cleaning plastic coverings which seem to work really well. It goes without saying that if this is clay you want to throw with without mixing it with another harder batch, you simply have to let it get a bit drier before you start to wedge it up. But if you're mixing two bodies together of different firmnesses, it helps to layer them up like this. I just take a slice of each and make a big stack of the two. This is a technique I used to do a lot at Maze Hill Pottery when I was the apprentice for Lisa Hammond. We'd make a custom mix of clay from various different clay bodies and we'd also layer in sand as we went, in giant big blocks like this, which are then cut into chunks and spiral wedge or cut wedge, which are the two techniques I'm going to be showing you now. The first method will be cut wedging. This is a method where you slice through the block and slam one half of the layers down upon the other. Each time this set of moves is repeated, you essentially double the amount of layers, and I continue cut wedging until the clay is completely smooth. So here, if say we start with 20 layers, and I go through the procedure of cut wedging the block 20 times, there'll be more than 20 million layers by the time I'm finished wedging, which is more than enough to completely homogenise the lump of clay and to remove any hard lumps or air pockets. I slam down the clay, leaving a gap on one side, and slice through the block as close to the middle as possible. One half is then slammed on top of the other, which doubles the layers to 40. I then take the same block and slam it the other way round. This compresses the layers and helps to make the block of clay more easily handleable. And then the process repeats again. I throw the block down so that there's a gap. I slice through. I take one half, which you can see the layers of quite clearly, and I slam it down onto the other. I then take the block of clay, flip it upside down, and hit it against the table once again. I then turn the lump so it's lengthways away from me, and repeat the process again. You'll see the layers multiplying each time, so it's quite an obvious way, especially for beginners, to learn how to wedge, as you can see what effect the wedging is having upon the clay. Equally, it's quite an easy process to learn, as compared to say spiral wedging or ram's head wedging, as all you have to do is remember a few basic steps. It can also be a useful method for wedging larger lumps of clay, and it also exerts less stress on the body as compared to spiral wedging. Then of course there's using a pug mill too, but I think a potter needs to be able to have the skill of being able to wedge without a pug mill. It's mandatory. It's one of the most basic and important skills in the whole of the craft. So whether it's spiral wedging, cut wedging, or ram's head wedging, you have to have mastered at least one of those. As I'm wedging, if a particular spot on my birch ply table becomes too saturated, I'll simply scrape it away and continue wedging in the same place, or I'll just move over a few inches to an unsaturated part of the table. But if the clay is especially wet and sticky, I'll do the wedging on one of my plaster bats, so it doesn't stick nearly so much, and the absorbent plaster will actually dry out the clay a tiny bit, which could be helpful. Of course, other potters will have different ways of doing things. This video simply demonstrates the way I do them in my studio. And here's the clay after being cut wedged 20 times, perfectly smooth throughout and without any air pockets too. I'll then shape these lumps of clay into large blocks, so I can store them and wrap them up in plastic for longer periods of time to keep it nice and soft. In the summer months I'll give them a good spray of water too, just to keep them from drying out, and then I'll wrap them up with plastic quite tightly, especially if I plan on storing them long term. I prefer to use different consistencies of clays for different types of pots. So for medium bowls and plates, for instance, I like to use softer clay, so I try to always keep a small store of that available in case I need to make those. Now it's time for some spiral wedging. My workbench is quite tall and there's a step in the floor that you can see too, so I use a few boards just to raise me up a little bit. It's easier to spiral wedge when you can exploit your upper body weight to push down on the clay. Rather than only using your arms, you can rock back and forth and use your body weight to help push down. I'll definitely make a video in the future that explains spiral wedging in a lot greater detail. It's like kneading bread, but the opposite, as the intention is to remove all the air from the lump of clay. Essentially, I'm pressing and folding the clay in a spiral motion, where the spirals are ever decreasing in size, and eventually all pockets of air and any inconsistencies in texture are removed. Spiral wedging especially is a process that takes a lot longer to learn as compared to cut wedging. but essentially it can be simplified into a few simple movements, although when done quickly it can be quite difficult to understand. And one of the most difficult things is starting off the spiral wedging process. Once you have the specific shape and the designated region where your hands are doing the work, it's actually a bit easier. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm pushing the clay down straight, and then I'm lifting it up with a slight rotation as I pull it back up, so that when I push it down again, I'm incorporating a tiny bit of new clay in each fold. It's a process that's tricky to master, but it's also wonderfully useful, as it allows you to wedge up smaller amounts of clay very quickly. I mostly taught myself this process after watching videos on YouTube almost 10 years ago, and since then I must have spent literally thousands of hours standing over my workbench wedging clay, especially during my apprenticeships. And normally with these, once wedged up, I'll block them up and store them with the rest. But here's a little cross section so you can see the smoothness of the clay, save from where it's been torn at the bottom and where a speck of sand has been dragged through with the wire. Anyhow, I hope this video gave you a little bit of an insight into my clay recycling process here at the studio. It's very rudimentary, but it works, especially as it's just me here. There isn't actually a huge amount of reclaim to get through. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.